They had always said, "Never judge a book by its cover," as if the warning were a shield against small-mindedness. But out here, on the ragged edge of the Wyoming territory, people judged a woman with the speed and certainty of a lynx. Lydia Hale felt that swift, sharp assessment the moment she stepped down from the stagecoach. A lone Eastern woman with a single trunk, sensible boots, and a face used to kindness rather than suspicion. The other travelers made room for her, as if she were a gust of wind, polite, cold, and wary. Shawls were tightened, embroidery paused, and eyes flicked away like cattle startled by thunder. Each bump in the rutted road seemed to jar loose another whispered opinion about what a woman in the West should be: meek, small, obedient, the sort of person who ministered to others' comforts while her own wants shrank into the wallpaper. They could not see the calluses beneath Lydia's gloves, the nights spent at her grandmother's bedside in Pennsylvania, or the steel that had kept her upright through loss and debt. If you're reading this and you're tuning in from somewhere new, tell me where below. And don't forget to subscribe. There's a special scene saved for tomorrow that you won't want to miss. Letters had opened a door Lydia hadn't known still existed. After Agnes Hale, her grandmother, finally surrendered to a long, slow sickness in the winter of 1882, Lydia found herself holding more debts than she had furniture, but also a stack of envelopes tied with a twine bow. Letters from a man named Thomas Beckett, rancher, widower, and now, by the wording of the matrimonial advertisement, a possible husband. His first letter was plain and steady. "I am a man of the land, 52 years of weather and work, seeking a companion of strength and good character." He promised no poetry, only honesty. In those months of exchange, the paper between them took on a life of its own. Lydia wrote of the books she'd read by lamplight, of the lullabies Agnes used to sing while darning socks, and of a private longing to see a horizon that was not hemmed by brick. Thomas wrote of long winters and cattle drives, and a land so wide it made a person feel both small and large at once. Between his careful sentences and her candid replies, something that looked suspiciously like hope, perhaps even love, took root. Friends and church neighbors tried to prune that hope into practicality. "Men out west expect you to shrink," said Mrs. Calder from the sewing circle, "to trade your opinions for a warm hearth and obedient hands." They spoke of Beatrice Beckett, Thomas's mother, as a pillar of a family that prized reputation and neatness over sentiment. "She won't take kindly to an Eastern girl with no dowry," warned the vicar with compassionate severity. Yet Lydia had seen enough of the world to know that poverty and propriety were not the same thing, and when the letters kept arriving, each stamped with meticulous care, a decision was made. On a sharp October morning, she packed the trunk Agnes had once polished, tied the last of the string around a bundle of well-worn handkerchiefs, and climbed aboard a westbound train with her heart pocketed in hope and practicality. The ride west was 4 days that blurred like watercolor washes, fields folding into plains, towns becoming way stations, stage lights dimming farther behind. Fellow passengers treated Lydia with the particular chill reserved for women who had chosen an uncertain fate instead of courting safety. She sat straight-backed, watching the rails click into a steady metronome that seemed to time both departure and arrival. When the train wheezed and hissed into Laramie Station under a wide, pale sky, there was no one with flowers or fanfare, only a single rough wagon and a man in a cracked leather hat who called her name once and pointed at her trunk. That man was Amos, the ranch hand who drove the wagon to the Beckett homestead. Lydia stepped onto the wooden platform in a travel-stained brown dress and sensible boots, planted her feet on the sun-bleached boards, and climbed into the waiting wagon as the prairie stretched itself out like an unrolled canvas. The Beckett ranch sat in a bowl of land between two low ridges. A 2-story house made gray by wind and weather, fences that braided the fields, and outbuildings that smelled of tack and hay. Smoke curled from a stoic chimney while cattle brooded across distant pastures. When Lydia knocked, Beatrice Beckett answered with an appraisal eye sharper than any auctioneer's. 50-odd, hair pulled into a tight knot, eyes like flint chips. Beatrice measured Lydia as if she were choosing a broodmare. "You're earlier than expected," she said without invitation, and stepped only far enough aside to let the new arrival pass. Inside, the house felt smaller than it looked from the outside. High ceilings and wide rooms bunched into claustrophobic etiquette. Silence there was not absence of sound, but a heavy presence, like a heavy curtain drawn between people and speech. Lydia learned quickly what the house required. Eat quietly. Ask no questions about family business. Wear plain undergarments and keep one's eyes modestly low. Table manners here were more than decorum. They were social law. Whatever part of Lydia belonged to the East, to Agnes's simple wisdom and the church pew where she had once sat knitting, it marked her as suspect. Beatrice never addressed her directly about her past. She spoke about Lydia as one speaks about an unwanted heirloom. Thomas himself was kind but reserved, a man who seemed almost surprised by the warmth he'd found in Lydia's letters. In person, he was steadier than paper had promised, but wrapped in the reticence of a household lucky to have its routines unbroken. Lydia felt the room itself holding its breath, waiting to see whether she would conform. 3 weeks of adaptation followed like a slow hymn. Lydia rose before dawn to bank the cook stove, tended a small kitchen garden, mended shirts by lamplight, and learned the cadence of a land that demanded effort in exchange for mercy. She refused, though, to compress herself into a narrower shape than her spirit allowed. Beatrice mistook that refusal for insolence. In her eyes, Lydia was, at best, awkward, at worst, ungrateful. Yet there was someone in the house who did not see Lydia as a problem, but as a person. Silas Beckett, Thomas's father, whose mind sailed sometimes beyond harbor and landed in fragments of memory. One morning, Lydia found him struggling with a shirt's buttons, the simple task transformed into a bewildering puzzle by fogged recollection. She helped him with a patience that comes from loving the small things into being. She smoothed the fabric, guided his hands, hummed a song Agnes had once sung. For a moment his eyes lit with recognition, and he murmured, "You remind me of someone who used to sing while she worked." Lydia didn't correct him, she sang, and the music melted a little of Silas's confusion. Work on the ranch was practical and direct. Lydia earned the cowboy's respect without fanfare by doing what needed doing, repairing fence lines with wire and stubborn hands, helping with sick calves, organizing the cluttered office so Thomas could find his ledgers. Her sleeves were perpetually rolled. Hay dust often freckled her hems. Thomas noticed the shift in how the hired men tipped their hats when she passed. He watched how she moved, an economy of motion backed by strength, and found himself surprised by a swelling admiration he had not expected to admit aloud. It was there in the tilt of his head when she left the room, and in the way his work slowed when she entered the corrals. But family and habit make strange bedfellows. Beatrice's scorn was an ever-present murmur that sought to smother whatever warmth might be between them. An invitation, more a summons, from the ladies of town arrived in the form of a quilting circle, and Lydia went because it felt like the next sensible stitch in the social fabric. She wore her plainest dress, sat quietly, and listened as women traded gossip about weather, weddings, and who had the best churn. When she rose to leave, something about the way she carried herself, quiet, steady, present, arrested more than one whisper. Independence she showed them without intent, did not always drum at the rafters. Sometimes it flowed like water, patient and inevitable. That night, in the kitchen, her palm brushed Thomas's forearm while reaching for flour. Something wordless passed between them. A spark, a memory, a recognition. Later, he sat alone by candlelight and read her letters anew, as if hoping the paper might explain the fuller, harder truth in front of him. Beatrice noticed the change in her son with a swiftness that tasted like vinegar. "She's softened you," she told him over breakfast, the accusation a thin, sharp thing. Eastern charm and stubbornness will make you look weak. Yet Thomas felt a new allegiance that had nothing to do with duty or convenience. Lydia had become a presence that belonged not to reputation, but to him, and for the first time he resisted the expectation that he would hand his life to someone else's wishes. His mother's resentment festered like an old bruise, hard to ignore and easy to inflame. The town's important dinner, a gathering of ranchers, merchants, and wives under the polite pretense of business, demanded premeditated perfection. Beatrice prepared the house as if polishing an heirloom. Plates were counted and china was polished until it shone. Lydia was dressed in her best, a sober, high-collared blue silk that pinched at the neck and made her scalp ache under the weight of a forced hairstyle. She was seated conspicuously at the far end of the long table, closer to the kitchen than the head where power and conversation brewed. The placement was intentional. It announced what the family thought of her position. Conversation orbited around cattle prices, railroad prospects, and politics of the territory, and Lydia listened, practicing the small, ambiguous art of belonging without erasing herself. When dessert arrived and toasts had been made, Beatrice lifted her crystal glass like a gauntlet and addressed the room with a voice laced in polite cruelty. "Pray tell," she said, smiling a smile that was sharp as a coin. "What exactly does our guest bring to this table?" The question dropped into the dinner room like a stone into still water. Forks stilled, breath caught. Lydia, whose life had been more about tending the inward needs of the soul than cultivating social polish, set down her fork with deliberate calm. She met Thomas's eyes across the table, steady, full of the weather of honesty, and spoke softly but clear. "I am the table," she said. "But are you offering a seat worth taking?" The phrase landed like a bell. Shock rippled around the room, scandal at the audacity, admiration at the truth. Thomas's mouth almost betrayed a smile. Beatrice's knuckles whitened on her glass. The rest of the evening moved through a brittle civility, the sort that covers ruptures temporarily but leaves cracks beneath. In the days following, Lydia performed every duty to glass-like perfection, but the warmth of her early hopeful gestures had hardened into a cool efficiency. She continued to care for Silas with the same tender practice that required no applause, and he responded with the clear, delighted greetings that made her mornings lighter. Thomas watched the distance grow with an ache that made him restless at night. The early intimacy, the casual touch, the shared glance, had frozen into formalities. He tried to bridge the widening canyon with words and small offers, but Beatrice's commentary, like a persistent frost, nipped at even the bravest shoots. A storm broke across the prairie like a test from heaven. Black clouds swallowed the horizon, and wind began a keen that cut like an old blame. Rain hammered the roof, lightning split the sky. The ranch convulsed into survival. Horses whinnied, cattle surged, and the hands ran to tie down what could be saved. Inside the house, Beatrice paced like a queen whose kingdom might soon be compromised. "Trouble," she muttered, eyes flickering toward Lydia, as if the woman's very presence were a summons for storm. Thomas, who had been waiting for a moment to declare himself at last, found his courage when the storm set the world on edge. "Send her back," Beatrice hissed in the parlor. "You made a mistake. Your standing will suffer." For the first time, Thomas's answer was not a mumbled concession. He stood, voice steady and edged with a resolve that surprised even himself. "No," he said. "She is what I chose." Lydia found herself in the barn while the storm did its worst, watching water flood through broken slats and thinking of the old house in Pennsylvania, of Agnes's steady hands. Rain plastered her dress to her, but she did not move. Thomas came to stand beside her without fanfare, boots sinking into mud, the barn's scent of wet hay and old wood wrapping them. "You were right," he said simply. "I wanted someone who would fit what was expected. But I would rather build something with you than settle for a seat at someone else's table." Lydia's reply was not dramatic. It was precise and honest, a small, human thing. "I did not come for rescue," she said. "I came because a life built with respect is better than a life bought with pity." The barn's shadows listened to them speak, and, for the first time in months, the air between them was warm with possibility instead of being heavy with obligation. Morning afterward found the yard littered with debris, branches snapped, tarps shredded, fences sagging. The land, though bruised, had endured, and people at the Beckett ranch had emerged changed. Lydia and Thomas worked side by side in the barn as if the storm had taught them a new rhythm. They selected rough boards, measured, hammered, and sanded without pretense. Their hands learned one another's language. When she passed the saw, he steadied the wood. When he raised the nail, she held the plank in place. They built a table neither meant for display nor for dignity by tradition, but for daily use, broad, honest, scarred by human effort and love. When they carried it into the kitchen and set it beneath the window that caught the morning, Beatrice watched from the sill. Her expression was a map of defeat and a strange, grudging admiration. Silas, always the truer judge in matters of heart, clapped his hands once and called Lydia, "my girl," with a voice loose with affection. The table was imperfect. In places the wood told of knots and repairs, of lives lived and storms weathered. That imperfection made it right. Around it they ate bread, torn by hand, spoke aloud of plans for spring planting, and listened to each other's quieter wishes. Lydia's smile returned slowly, like a thaw unfurling from the inside, and Thomas's laughter came more easily, without the stiff formalities that had defined his family's gatherings. The town eventually noticed. Men tipped their hats with a new ease toward Lydia. The quilting circle found their gossip softened into curiosity rather than scorn, and even Beatrice, who stood at the kitchen window more often than she admitted, began to call Lydia by her name when no one else was present. Winter anchored itself in the valley like a white, patient king. Snow came soft and relentless, and the ranch learned to find warmth in hearth and in companionship. Lydia kept Agnes's china stacked in the kitchen, and, on Sunday mornings, she placed a small sprig of rosemary at the table's center, as a reminder of home and of the small rituals that stitch life together. Thomas learned to ask for her opinion about cattle rotations, about hiring a helper, about how best to shore up a leaky roof. They argued once in the long, honest way of people who care enough to be honest. They made up with a loaf of bread and the kind of laughter that leaves cheeks warm. In the end, what Lydia brought to the Beckett table was more than hands that could sew, or a willingness to keep the house tidy. She brought insistence on being seen, the courage to speak when speech was called for, and the steady labor of building a life day by day. Thomas found in her a partner who would not be carved into someone else's ideal, but who would shape, with him, a shared space where both could be strong. Beatrice, in the quiet spaces when the house settled and the grandchildren's voices spun in the yard, discovered a new and unexpected softness. Silas, when memory unloosed in a sudden flash, would point at Lydia and say with affectionate certainty, "She sings while she works, just like someone I loved." If this story moved you, please tell me where you're reading from. Subscribe so you don't miss the bonus scene I've written for tomorrow, and share it with a friend who loves a slow, honest burn of a romance. Thank you for reading. And remember, the strongest tables are often the ones built by hands willing to work together, one ordinary day at a time.